This tutorial is brought to you by Hey, what's up guys? My name is Josh Inobakare and welcome to Olufemi Tutorials. What's up guys? We're talking about aperture. Now, aperture is the second pillar of exposure. It's important that when you are getting perfect exposure that you use the three pillars of exposure, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, to make sure that your footage is neither too bright or too dark. When we're talking about aperture, we're talking about the hole that's within your lens that light is traveling through in order to expose your sensor, which is capturing your footage. The aperture measurement, aperture is measured in f-stops, is referring to the diameter of that hole. Now, this is very interesting, and I admit it confused me and it confuses a lot of people when they first learn about aperture. Aperture is measured in a really kind of backwards way. The smaller the aperture number, say an f-stop of 1.4, is referring to a bigger hole, meaning more light is allowed to be let in with a bigger hole, but a bigger hole is measured with a smaller f-stop number. The absolute smallest f-stop number that I think exists for most cameras is a 1.2. That's a really wide hole. It lets a lot of light in. Now, when you're referring to a more narrow aperture, which is letting less light in, you're actually going to use a larger number. So you'd use an f-stop of say 32. So it's very interesting. F-stop seems to be backward. Why does a larger number mean more narrow f-stop, and why does a smaller number refer to a wider f-stop? It seems backward, right? Well, what you need to do is, if you look at how f-stops look, it's f and then there's a slash and then there's the number. What you got to do is you got to pretend that you're looking at a fraction, because guess what? You actually are looking at a fraction. F stands for a constant. Constant is focal length, which has to do with how zoomed in or how zoomed out your lens is. We're going to talk about that later, but just think about f as part of a fraction. If you think of, say, a narrow aperture of, say, 32, it's going to look like f/32. Now, that fraction, f32, is actually a lot smaller than, say, f1.2. So if you can tell that f32 is actually a lot smaller of a number than, say, f over 1.2. So it kind of makes sense now. The number f over, or you can pretend f is a 1. You can just pick any number as the number for that constant. If you pretend f is a 1, you'll see that the fraction 1 over 1.2 is actually a lot larger. And so it makes sense that that would represent a larger diameter than a smaller number, such as, say, 1 over 32 or f over 32. So that's why aperture is measured in this way. It makes sense once you think about it a little bit. Now, just with shutter speed, if you remember, aperture does not only affect how bright or how dark your footage is, there's also a side effect. The side effect for aperture is it affects what's called the depth of field. The depth of field is referring to the area in your footage that is in focus from back to front. Field is just a fancy way of saying focus. So you can think of it as the depth of focus from the front to the back, or from the back to the front. A very wide aperture, we're going to use the 1.2 example, is going to have a very shallow depth of field. That means the area that is in focus from back to front is going to be laser thin. So you could literally have the tip of your nose be in focus, but the back of your nose to be not in focus. So the amount that's in focus for a really shallow depth of field that you get with a 1.2 f-stop could be literally from the tip of your nose to the back of your nose. That laser thin slice of your footage, of your 3D space, is the only part that's in focus. So everything in the background is going to be out of focus, and everything in the foreground is also going to be out of focus and blurry. You usually can't tell that stuff is out of focus in the foreground because you don't usually have anything in the foreground, but you always have lots of stuff in the background. So that's when you see these images or these pieces of footage where everything's thrown out in the background. Meaning when I say thrown out, I mean everything's out of focus or blurry. It means that they're probably using a really shallow depth of field, and therefore they're using probably a really wide aperture to get that shallow depth of field. The opposite of a shallow depth of field is a deep depth of field. A deep depth of field means that you have a large amount of your 3D space that will be in focus, as opposed to a shallow laser thin amount. So if you use a really narrow aperture with a really large f number, let's say you could go back again to the same example of f32, you're going to get a really deep depth of field, meaning that you're going to have a lot of your image in focus. So a really deep depth of field could be, instead of having just from the front of my nose to the back of my nose being in focus, I could have from the front of my nose all the way to the mountain that's 5 miles away be in focus. That's how long the depth of field is. That's how deep the depth of field is. So again, if you use a lens if you use an aperture that is extremely narrow, just know that you're gonna get a darker image, but you're also gonna get a depth of field that's a lot deeper than, say, an aperture that is a lot wider. I mean, you're gonna have a lot brighter of an image, but your depth of field is going to be a lot shallower. Aperture is really interesting because the range of f-stops that you're able to use differs depending on the lens that you have. I really like my Canon 50mm lens because it has it's able to go down to a 1.4 f-stop. This of course means that I'm able to get really shallow depths of field, and I'm able to throw the background out of focus and make it really blurry. And also I'm able to shoot in really dark environments because the wide capability that it has with its really wide f-stop allows a lot more light to be let in, and I can shoot really easily in low light environments. Some lenses, however, like a lot of the standard lenses that come with your Canon DSLR when you first buy it, they're called kit lenses. They only go down to 3.5. They only give you an f-stop of 3.5. Therefore, the capability in low light is a lot more limited than, say, a lens that has a f-stop capability of 1.4. Here's a new definition. A lens that has an f-stop number that's a lot lower, like 1.4, is called a fast lens. If someone says that this lens is faster than this lens, it means that it has a wider aperture capability, meaning it has an f-stop that's going to be a lower number than the other lens that's been compared to. Hey guys, check out this next video talking about ISO. ISO is the third pillar of exposure. Make sure to check it out to complete our series on exposure.